Rentbacks are very useful when we have sellers that need a little bit of extra time in their property, right? So you've got situations where maybe there's a job transfer coming up and they want to get the house sold so they have the certainty that it's sold before they leave. They don't want to be like, oh God, I got to time this to where I sell it the day that I'm supposed to go to St. Louis. That's horrible. So for that person, a rentback would be really good. Go ahead, get the home sold, and then stay in the house for generally up to 59 days. Awesome. They get to rent back that property from the new owners and they become tenants. What I really want to get into here is kind of the weeds that we don't talk about on the normal day-to-day with these rent backs, the big what ifs. And when things get really pointed, really kind of hairy, and they're like, well, what if this, what if that, right? It's useful for sellers who don't have cash on hand for moving. We get a lot of elderly people that the house needs a lot of work. And, you know, if they sell it, they don't have any money to improve the house. They don't have any money to move either. This is where Greg May and Agents Capital comes in. You guys familiar with Greg May? Yeah. He's great about coming in, giving them money to move out of the house, which is helpful. And then also going in and renovating the house. A lot of people are really locked because they're just month to month on fixed income. A rent back is really good if you can sell their house because now they get the money and then they can move after they have the cash to their new place. Granted, it might be in rougher condition, but still takes the pressure off the seller in case they have like a dedicated move by date, like I talked about. And it's good for a seller in a declining price market. Okay. So January, or let's just say June prices are here, July here, August here. It's trailing downward. It's better for a person in that situation to sell sooner than later, right? Because they're selling higher in the market, right? Great. So if they can sell early and do a 2-month rent back, then they're going to put themselves in a situation where they're selling high and then moving to their next place relatively lower. So if they can lock something in and buy something later, it's in their best interest. 6 months ago, it was the opposite. If you did a rent back, you were eating it because your next place was going to be $10,000 or $20,000 more expensive, right? Completely different climate now. Typically, you only get 59 days on paper. And I want to get into some scenarios with this as well. And then it can be $0 or more for the rent back. It doesn't have to cost any money for that entire period of time. And I got I got another picture for you guys. And then when that happens, just so you guys are aware, and a lot of times the sellers want to know this too. Well, what happens, when I stay here? Like, what are the rules? Great. That person goes into a leasehold interest, just like any other person that's renting a property. And then the new owner becomes a landlord, just like if they bought an investment property for that period of time. And then the new mortgage payment drops on the first of the following month after. That's a big key to the deal making part of this. And it's how we're able to sell that to buyers in a lot of cases. Brian? Okay, I'm seeing lots of yawning out there. I know that means your brains are downloading a lot of information and creating new creases. That's awesome. So we're almost there. Take a deep breath. Okay. All right. In here, I put 2 different scenarios up. So I wanted you guys to have like a visual conceptualization of what this looks like. All right. Say we've got a person that gets their home in escrow mid-January and it's going to, early January, it's going to close early February, right? In this scenario, we had to negotiate a 59-day no-cost rent back. Okay. And I set this up specifically because in this scenario, this 59-day period from the beginning of February all the way to the 1st of April is not costing our buyer monthly for that. Yeah, some stuff is in closing costs. I don't want to get too far into that, but just their out-of-pocket day-to-day stuff, they're not paying for that mortgage until April 1st. So this whole period right here doesn't cost them anything. In this scenario, we're doing a full 59 days. So there's like, call it a 10-day period in April where our buyer, they got to suck it up and eat that 10 days of mortgage costs before they're able to move in. If that's what you have to do to get the deal, that's what you have to do to get the deal. What we need to do is be aware of that number and be able to speak to that number to our buyers so they know what they're actually signing up for. And the better we do that, the easier it is to structure this deal. That's also something you want to talk to the listing side about. Hey, in this scenario, we're not only not moving into our new house and taking advantage of our free month and a half that we usually would, we're giving that up to you, and we're actually paying for your living. Flipped, we're paying for your living for these 10 days. So that's your opportunity to take a little bit of power back from that listing side and say, hey, I'm giving you a ton here, but you need to be able to quantify that, okay? This other scenario down here is a little bit different. This other scenario here, say it's the same early January to early February escrow period. Then you got a 45-day rent back at PITI, not HOA. That's something you need to set up and have a discussion with on the side. PITI is what we're shooting for. You can have HOA costs rolled into it as well if you negotiate that, but customarily it's just going to be PITI. What that is, principal and interest, taxes and insurance, that the new buyer is taking on. It's not the seller's PITI, it's a new buyer's PITI. We're asking the seller to pay our buyer for the right to stay in that property. You're going to pay rent at what it would cost us so that that buyer is not out that money. We love this scenario for buyers because this is free cash. We weren't paying a mortgage anyway. So now we're getting basically an extra month and a half of our mortgage payment refunded. That's huge. So if we can get that as a buyer, heck yeah, I'll take that all day long. And that's a value of, thousands to almost tens of thousands of dollars. In this scenario, you'll notice it's 45 days. So there's a gap here between March and April. That's when that person gets to move in. Not only do they get a ton of money, but they also get to move in 2 weeks before their first mortgage payment is due. This is a great scenario for the buyer side. And I wanted to highlight these two things so you guys can keep this in mind when you get ready to have these conversations with your buyers and sellers. Plot this out. Just makes it a lot easier for everybody to get on board with what we already know about the process. Okay. I believe we have one more slide. Great. So when we get into the rent backs, the key to this is there's time periods, there's limits to these things. You can't have someone staying in a property indefinitely unless the person buying it is buying it as an investor. You got 59 days. After 59 days, the lender says, you're not moving into this as a primary residence at this point. You've basically hit 2 months. You're now a landlord. That's a whole different loan category. Can a person do it? Yeah, if they take out the proper loan and get it on title the right way. But for most of us in this room, we're generally representing home buyers. So we have that 59-day limit. What happens if you get somebody that's got a tenant in place for 70 days? You really want to make this deal. The seller's not willing to extend escrow, but you can only do 59 days. You're so close to making a deal. What do? I heard cash for keys. That's an option.
Mortgage fraud.
Mortgage fraud. That's another great one.
Am I the only one who thought that's what he was getting at?
Yeah. I just want to say that was Steve Winter. Yeah. And that brings about another conversation, right? So let's just say you got a cool seller, you got a cool buyer. They're like, hey man, these guys can probably, work this off the books, so to speak, right? The second you do that though, what you're actually signing them up for is you've said in writing that you're going to have keys to that property in 59 days. So as a seller, if you're like, yeah, we'll do the deal, but just knowing that I'm not moving out of here until day 70. Well, that buyer has the legal right to kick you out at day 59. So yeah, I understand there's a lot with evictions and things like that. But as a seller, if you agree to that and you don't have any protections outside of that escrow, you can get kicked out at day 59. So that's risk that goes with that trust. If you're a buyer, right, in that scenario, and let's just say without the 59 days, say you have a buyer and they're worried that this person only has like so many days. What if they don't move out? That's a real concern too, right? Has anybody had somebody overstay their welcome on a rent back? Yeah, I've had many of them. Not so many that I had to evict, but that's like, yeah, 30 days turned into 40. Like, all right, well, it's an asshole move, but okay. Things happen. But what do you do with that, right? So how do we convey confidence to buyers to take that deal, giving them that rent back with assurances? And that's when we get into the contracts and the forms, okay? The big key to this whole thing is knowing that as soon as that happens and it turns over, your seller becomes a tenant and the buyer becomes the landlord. The buyer gets all of those landlord rights, which in California is not that grand, but you have some, okay? And your ability to sell this deal comes to how well you can speak about those landlord rights, okay? And then that gets into the documentation that we're going to use. So there's two types of rent backs that we're going to go with. One is an SIP. It's 29 days or less, so less than 30 days. And then there's the residential lease after sale, the RLAS. That is for 30 to 59 days. 59 days, that's the max. The RLAS has a lot more to it because that person's camping out there for a long time. It's got several more pages than the SIP does. If you have a tenant in place, you have a TIP, but we'll cover that one on a separate dialogue. So that 29 days or 30 to 59 days, you have the option to assign a lease with that rent back to further protect your buyers. You can also charge a deposit at the same time so that your buyer has the leverage to kick that person out when the time comes. I know Kyle's adamant about catching a deposit. Sometimes I don't bring up the deposit because I just want to keep things nice and cool. They're a low flight risk. Maybe the situation lends to it, but it's something that you ultimately put your clients at risk with.
With the deposit, though, it can sometimes be tricky as to who's going to be holding on to the deposit, because escrow doesn't normally want to hold on to it after close.
Yeah.
So you just have to be concerned about where the money goes.
Exactly.
Sellers.
You got to figure it out. Sometimes escrow will do it. I always try to have escrow do it.
Yeah.
So it's.
Sometimes escrow says they did it.
Yeah.
And then they did it.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Anything can happen.
Escrow make a mistake? No
Yeah.
way. And that being said, there's a lot to structuring that lease so that it's got teeth for your clients. But that's what you want to set up in advance, because once you set that stuff up, it's in writing. You can't go back and change it afterwards. And the last thing you want is calls after you close. These people won't get out of my house, right? A sticky situation. You're making promises to people they're going to get their dream home, but then there's a camper in it and they can't get rid of it. It's a big problem, right? So SIP, 29 days or less, RLAS 30 to 59 days. You can add a lease to that, and deposits also go along with that as well.